So several decades ago, there was this popular idea that all of the world's problems could be solved with a massive information campaign. World wars could be solved. They'd end completely if all people just had a better understanding of other people. We would be able to prevent natural disasters from being quite so catastrophic if we could just prepare for them better. And if people knew how to respond after a natural disaster, then we could drop the death tolls dramatically. Disease and famine and economic disaster and political turmoil, it was all believed. More information was the cure for it all. So that with more and better journalism and history and science and data and information, people would be better equipped to act in the world, to do new things. And so the world, you may have lived through this massive information revolution that our world has gone through, starting with television, moving into the internet, growing exponentially in recent years with social media. The world now has so much information. It's coming out of our noses. In the 80s and the 90s, a guy named Neil Postman predicted that information isn't going to solve the world's problems. Knowing something about extreme poverty isn't the same thing as doing something about extreme poverty. Believing that human trafficking is an issue doesn't mean that you're motivated to act on it. This is what Postman said, but can you hear James? What is faith good for if it doesn't affect the way that we live? Like, this is the question that opens our passage this morning. What good is it, James asks in chapter 2, verse 14. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone says he has faith but does not have actions? Can that faith save him? The answer that James is looking for to the question of what good is it is nothing. It's no good. It is good for literally nothing. Faith that doesn't energize our lives is utterly useless. It's like holding a battery. True story, I have faith that there's energy in this battery. I've never seen a battery get filled with electricity. I can't tell you exactly how it all works, though I know we have some electrical engineers in here who might be able to school me on it. I've been told that batteries are packed with power, and I've seen them work before. Cool, like I believe. But what good is this battery? What is it good for if it sits in my pocket? Sure, I mean, it's got all sorts of potential, but its value is experienced when it is plugged into a device. Its usefulness is only experienced when it is put into action. If I'm not going to use this battery, it might as well be dead, because the energy in it is good for nothing. And this analogy can get stretched a little bit further. It's not just that an unused battery is as good as dead. Over time, unused batteries actually die. And so consider this micro tragedy, right? I mean, on the landscape of the world and real tragedy, this is a micro tragedy. This little thing packed with energy, saved and stored only to slowly lose all of its potential to power something in the world, to die having never used its power, to exist for good, yet doing nothing. This is what James says about a human life that talks about faith, that has something called faith, but that then does nothing requiring faith, nothing that is motivated by faith, that this is life that is actually dead. It reminds me of a novel that I say reading. I'm listening to an audiobook, and it's really long, and it's taking me forever. But I'm technically reading it right now. The main character is a guy named Shadow, and his wife gets in a car accident, and she sort of dies. I say that because she's sort of undead, and she keeps it's a weird book. She keeps showing up throughout the story, and she hates not being alive and not being dead. But at one point, she shows up to her husband Shadow and warns him that he needs to start living. And this confuses him, right? He's the alive one. But she goes on to tell him that even before her car accident, he wasn't living. She describes him just sort of moving through life. He worked, he took care of her, but he wasn't really driven by anything. He wasn't inspired by anything. He wasn't moved to do good, to make life better for people, or to do anything. Shadow was just content to keep existing in the world. And his wife called him on it. "This is not living," she said. "You are dead. Maybe more dead than I am," she said. Which creates this question. It's a fascinating question. How many of us are technically alive? Like, we have a heartbeat, but we're just sort of existing. How many of us talk about faith, but aren't truly alive in the way that we see Jesus alive when we read the Gospels? That we see people come alive when they encounter him in the Gospels. Twice, James writes to people who say they have faith, and he tells them that faith disconnected from action is dead. I want to try to get really practical this morning, but in a way that maybe you've not considered before. And to do that, I think it's important to look at something else that James has already said about death. And so if you've got your Bibles open, you're in James 2, turn back to James 1. If you remember, James 1 is his intro to all of the themes that he's going to unpack in chapters 2 through 5. And so in chapter 1, he introduces us to what brings death. Chapter 1, verse 14. We hear James say, "Each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers and sisters." James tells us that desire is the starting point for death. And so what do you desire? Do you desire wisdom? How about love? Do you desire safety or rest or security? Do you desire power or purpose? James wants you to know these desires can kill you. But maybe you already noticed something weird about this. These are the very things that also give us life. These are the very things where life is found, isn't it? God wants us to have wisdom. We already learned that in James. He literally tells us to ask him for it when we don't have it. He wants us to be loved and to love. God sent his own son for us because of his great love for us. God made us to be safe and secure and to rest. And so God makes promises about how and where we can find these things in him. But not only that, God gave us power. and he gives us purpose. So consider this for a moment. We have desires that are rooted in God's purpose for human life. He gives us these desires. But we are tempted to satisfy these desires in ways that he did not intend. We are tempted to let these desires rule over us, to tell us how we should live. And so desire, consider this, can lead us toward life or death. I'll never forget the meeting that I had with a psychologist as I was preparing for ordination. Many of you have heard this story before because it was really formational for me. She had already told me that according to all of the psychological assessments I had to take as part of this process, that I basically broke their scale when it comes to extroversion. And so she then says to me, like, your desire to be with people is good. And it is from God. And it can be a huge asset to your ministry. But it can also be a huge liability. She told me that I will be tempted to spend all of my time with people, to never rest, to never sit in silence or in solitude. And this, she reminded me, would destroy my soul. She told me that I could let my desires, the desires that God gave me, serve God. I could let those desires serve my family, serve me, serve my ministry, or I could make my family, I could make my ministry serve my desires as I serve them. I desire to be with people. You may have noticed that. It's who I am. But will I be with people on God's terms? Or will I let my desires call the shots on how and when I am with people? Here's another example. God made us to do good work in the world. And so if you desire to work, this is good. It is from God. But this desire can be misdirected. There is a path you can walk where this desire leads to death. The path where you never stop working. The path where you place too much importance on your work and where the most important thing about you is what you do. This desire gives birth to sin, which will bring forth death. God also gave us rest. He gave us a whole day of rest. If we desire rest, if you desire to rest, this is good. This is from God. But this desire can also be misdirected, there is a path in which rest can take us to death. You can rest too much. You can rest at the expense of others. You can grow lazy in your rest. Rest can turn into leisure. It can keep us from the work that God wants us to do. And so you can see again, this desire gives birth to sin, which brings forth death. If we have faith, we will trust God with our work, and our work will look different from those who don't have faith. And if we have faith, we will trust God with our rest, and our rest will look different from those who do not share our faith. Can you see what it means for faith to be connected to actions? There is, for us, a part of our tradition. It's a famous and ancient Christian confession of faith, and it starts this way, and maybe you've heard it. I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. It's a good one. If you don't know it, you should memorize it and say it a lot. It's cool. It's really good, and it's good for us to believe it. Lots of people have said that they believe it through the centuries. Because lots of people love to make grand speeches about their faith in God. But we should let Adam and Eve be a warning to us. What do we learn about faith and action from Adam and Eve, the first man and woman? Well, if you know anything about the story, Adam and Eve didn't just have faith that God was their creator. They got to walk with this guy. Right? They saw him, they talked with him. He provided for them directly. Well, after some period of time, the story tells us that they saw some fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and they wanted it, all of it. They wanted the knowledge. They wanted to be like God. They wanted the fruit. And so there's this interesting question in this. Which of those desires, the desire for knowledge, the desire to be like God, the desire for the fruit, was the bad desire? Was the desire that was wrong or sinful? I think I heard an answer. I wasn't necessarily expecting one. What'd you say? None of the above. Good job. That would have been embarrassing if I had to be like, oh, sorry, Andrew. No, none of them, right? They desired things that God made them to desire. They didn't sin by desiring these things. These desires were supposed to be met, though, by God in other ways. So Adam and Eve were to get their knowledge from him as he personally taught them as they walked together in the garden. And of course, they desired to be like God. There was nothing wrong with them desiring to be like God. Why? They were made in the image of God. They were made to reflect his glory and character, made to rule on his behalf. And why wouldn't they want fruit? God put them in a garden full of fruit trees, and he gave them all sorts of fruit. Adam and Eve had God-given desires that were good and could be satisfied in God alone. But they satisfied these desires in ways outside of God and outside of his purpose. And this is what we talk about when we talk about sin. This is what leads to death. Because it is the easiest thing in the world to say that we believe in God. It is one of the hardest things in the world to actually trust God with our desires. It takes us almost nothing to say, I have faith that God created me. But we know, right, how much harder it is to then trust him as creator when he tells me how I was made, what I was made for, and what I was not made for. But this is what obedient trust is. Obedience in the Bible isn't just about slavishly following rules, because if you follow rules and exactly the right rules, like you make it into heaven or something. Obedience is about trusting the voice of God. Obedience is about trusting the voice of the one who made us. And it's about trusting the victories of God. And that his voice and his victories will lead us into life. James highlights this obedience in two different stories. We get Abraham first, and then we get Rahab. God tells Abraham what to do. He says, Abraham, do this. And Abraham does it. Abraham responds to the voice of God. Rahab is different. She doesn't have God's voice. Not when she responds. She doesn't hear from him a clear call to action. But she sees what God has done. And she jumps on his side as fast as she can. Rahab responds to the victories of God. James tells us that Abraham was justified by his act of obedience. Justified is a super nerdy biblical word that has the same root as the word righteousness, or that we translate as righteous. And so what James is telling us is that having a relationship with God, being in right relationship with God, requires an act of trust, an act of obedience for Abraham to be in right relationship with him. I want you to consider this example. If your parent or somebody who's an authority over you tells you to do something that is good for you, and you refuse to do it, you're not in right relationship with that person. You're not in right relationship with your parent or this authority. It's not because you just didn't follow a rule and so you're bad. No, sometimes parents can make up bad rules. In this case, you're not in right relationship with your parent, with this authority, because you don't trust them. They said something. They told you to do something and you said no because you didn't trust that it would be good, that it would bring life. And here's the thing, it doesn't matter how many times you say you love your parent or trust your parent. Those words are hollow. They're empty. They're dead if that word of trust isn't followed with some sort of obedience. When God speaks and when God acts, this is the question for us. How do we respond? Like when we hear his voice, as we're reading the scriptures, as we're hearing God calling us to love our neighbors as ourselves, do we obey? Or when we see his victory, when we come to the Gospels and we see the victory that God has attained in Jesus Christ through his death and his resurrection, when we see Jesus ascend and sit at the right hand of the Father, when we see the victory of God in the world, when we see the Holy Spirit falling on the church, setting the church free from its slavery to sin and its fear of death, when we see the victory of God, are we moved to go with God? To follow him, to chase after, or, and this is the question for us, when you hear God's voice, when you see God's victory, do you find yourself paralyzed and unmoved? And I wonder what could be going on inside of us that would let us hear God's voice and experience God's victory and even say, I believe, I have faith, but then sit inactive, live unresponsive, resist obedience. To bring us to the end, I want to go back to the beginning of my sermon for a second. Neil Postman announced that information on its own would not be enough to change the world. For Postman, information without action is like calories without movement. Information without action is just a new form of entertainment, just as calories without movement is gluttony. Calories have a single purpose in God's design for us, to energize our bodies for life and activity. Information has a single purpose, to direct, to inform our actions. Before the internet and before social media, Postman diagnosed our culture, calling us information gluts. He said that we have consumed so much information with so little activity that we are nearly incapable of acting. We have trained ourselves to never respond, to never act, and to grow large and immovable on more information than we can do anything with. I think Postman has diagnosed the church in America. Eugene Peterson liked to point out that there is no time in Christian history where we have had more Christian music, Christian books, Christian conferences, specialized ministries, devotional materials, and discipleship resources at our fingertips than we do right now. And yet, these have not changed the way that we live. These have not made us more obedient. The church today is no less known for, or no more known for, its love of neighbor than it was however long ago. These resources have not expanded our desire to love our neighbors, not for the church as a whole. And I've been praying about this. I've thought about this for us here. I've been thinking about just how easy it is for us to show up to a worship service and to consume and experience passively, like gathering information. As the pastor who helped plan it, it's easy for me to passively consume. One of the things that I just felt convicted about at some point recently was when we sing words that talk about responding with some sort of bodily action, like raising hands or kneeling, that if I keep saying the words but never do them, that I'm training myself to speak without acting. And so I've started to, every time we sing words about raising hands, doesn't matter if I feel it or not, God is worthy. And to declare that truth and to do it, I say that, but I have not yet bowed down during words about bowing down, because that's awkward. What? I have not danced on a mountaintop. Although, yeah, we'll just leave that. But if I'm honest, raising my hands, way easier than being the only person who is suddenly bowing. I worry that we're being conditioned to hear God's voice and experience his victory, and then training ourselves to not respond, to fill up a battery week after week because we got rechargeable ones, and then just walk around with it in our pocket and let it drain itself. I get nervous that our instinct is to sit back and enjoy and not to step forward and act. One of the reasons why I worry about this sometimes is because I try to listen closely to the conversations that our different small groups are having, and I'm amazed all the time by the hunger for study, that there are so many people in our church. In fact, there's a bit of a reputation for how much and how many of us want to dig into the scriptures and ask hard questions and wrestle, but our groups often avoid or never get to the last question of the studies. What is God asking you to do to live out your faith? How is this passage that you're studying now calling you to live? And there's another reason why I get nervous that as a church we're cultivating inaction. And this comes from nearly 6 years of creating the Daily Worship Guide. I've done it at various times with other people, but this resource is by far the most unused resource that we have available to us as a church. And it's super interesting to me that this then is the resource that's most explicitly designed to help us love the people that we live with. And if you're like me, the people that I live with are the people that are the easiest to take for granted and to sort of just go through life with and not actively love. And this resource calls me to love them daily and also my neighbors, but it's mostly neglected. But when it's not, this is the thing that surprises me the most, is how often people have used the Daily Worship Guide and then said, yeah, I just didn't do the thing that it said to do that day. And when I ask questions of why, it's like, it's too hard. It seemed impractical. It was awkward. We like the short reading and the praying and the singing. Like, we can do that. But man, the doing, the acting, the taking steps that require faith, doing things that demonstrate trust in God, it's just a bit too much. It's a bit too far. And so the daily worship guide, a guide for daily living with God, for us just becomes one more source of spiritual information to consume. And we become not only information gluts, but gluttons of faith. This is one of, if not the main reason why we've been using this time in James to break up and just do something together. Because if we can't do something in this place, right, with these people who are all here saying, yeah, I have faith. I'm into Jesus. I'm here for that. If we can't share our thoughts on the scriptures and on Jesus and what God is leading us toward together, if we can't pray for each other, spur one another on toward love and good deeds, if we can't know each other's names, can I tell you, I'm often blown away by how many of us don't know the names of people in a pretty small community who've been worshiping together over a fairly long period of time. Like, if we can't love the neighbors that are in our own church, we're gonna struggle to love the neighbors outside. I love the call that the author of Hebrews gives us to what it looks like for us to be together. Spur one another on toward love and good deeds. When we break off into groups, that's what we're trying to do together. And so we're gonna break out into our groups, and Carrie gave me a great suggestion. I got a map that's gonna come up at any time. There we go, nice. And I'll explain that in a second. If you've been here, you kind of know what's going on. If you haven't been here, find somebody and then they'll help you figure it out. But here's what I want you to do. I want you to go around in your group, and would you answer 2 questions? They're really simple questions. One is, where have you seen faith in action? Don't tell long stories, just a quick, like, this is where I've seen faith in action. And then the second is, what is the love your neighbor action that God is asking you to take today? What's just the one thing? But I want to frame that around love your neighbor. God calls us to do a lot of things, but we learned last week that the heart of it is love your neighbor as yourself. This is the heart of what he's calling us to. And so, where have you seen faith in action? What is the one love your neighbor action that God is asking you to take today? And then if you would, a couple people just maybe pray for those specific things. And so